So as a maybe lead-off question, and both of you and even in conversation, how have you seen cities and downtowns impacted by these new realities that we talked about? And maybe more specifically, how has the changing nature of work and the future of office impacted commercial real estate and starting to redefine the role of the CBD?
Well, I think everyone here is probably aware of how much work has been changing, post-pandemic. There had been a slight shift to really being a little bit more remote, a little bit more flexible, and then the pandemic obviously shifted all of it. I would say we're still in a period of flux. We're still in a period of transition and experimentation. It has not really settled down, but certainly we're going to be seeing more flexibility. We're seeing, not that 9 to 5 sort of structured work. Probably people are coming in a little bit less, certainly more flexibility in terms of the hours. We're a very research-oriented firm. We started doing research on work trends right at the beginning of the pandemic, and have done it pretty much every 6 months since. So we've seen a real transition over the past few years, and what we're seeing right now is that people are not coming into offices even as much as they think they should be coming into offices, right? They know they can get the value out of being together, but they're not doing it. So that really impacts what's going on in cities. What are the challenges that keep people from coming in even as much as they think they should be? Commute patterns, the experience of being in the workplace and the downtown areas, childcare issues. A lot of that are the things that are really keeping people from going in. So those are things we can start looking to address. But I would say work is a key part of the system of downtowns. When you get people coming in, I think this is probably obvious to all of you, you get people coming in, they're really feeding the economic engine of downtowns, from the restaurants and the services. And we really have to be thinking, are we providing those services and restaurants and that 20-minute amenities for those workers to draw them in, to make it a destination that they want to come into, that it's worth the commute pattern coming into? Kate, if you want to add.
I think that's spot on. And if you look at the data, as you were saying, this is not a totally new phenomena. I think in 2019, 24% of employed people were doing some portion of their work remotely. That jumped up to nearly 40% in 2021. It's down to 34%, but that's still a lot of people who are spending a lot more time at home. And as you described, that has a big impact on office use, and certainly on vacancy, commercial real estate values. It has a huge impact on the amount of foot traffic downtown, the number of people who are out there supporting retail, supporting restaurants. And I think that the big concern right now is that as we are seeing or have seen that decline in activity and seeing increased office vacancy, seeing increased retail vacancy, we'll start seeing less and less enthusiasm among visitors, among residents, among workers in going to downtown. And the concern is that given the share of fiscal resources that downtowns provide for cities, the International Downtown Association, looking at a number of cities across the country, identified property taxes in downtowns, generating 5 to 10% of local property or fiscal resources. It's even higher in many other locations, despite the fact that downtowns are really only at about 2% of land area overall. If we don't see a change in that those those reduced fiscal resources will start to impact city services, which risks further diminishing the experience of downtown and locking ourselves into a cycle. As you said, I don't think that we have stabilized yet. Nobody knows what it's going to look like in 5 years. If you do, let me know. I'd like to meet you and invest in whatever it is that you're working on right now. But we do know that it's not going to look like it did in 2019. And so the cities that we're talking to are really focusing on the kinds of issues, Elizabeth, that you were describing, which is how do we create that kind of economic that kind of vitality, that kind of experience that in this moment when workers can really choose, not all workers certainly, but many workers can choose whether or not to come into the office. They want to make that choice to be there.
Yeah, one of the things that's really interesting that you mentioned a little bit, workers are coming into the office or being at home. What we're seeing is a big shift in the last few years is it's not the either or, either home or the office, third places. and out in the market or traveling or working at a coffee shop or a client site, that has grown tremendously in the last few years. So there's almost 3 areas that people could be working in, the office, a third place, or at home. And the home section of that has shrunk, whereas the third place section of that has really grown, particularly in certain industries, technology, media, where there's a little bit more flexibility, their work patterns, what they need to be doing is a little bit different. So I'll be very interested to see how that starts to play out too, what those third places are, and maybe they're not that central business district, maybe they are, what Kate and I were talking about a little earlier was activity centers, and how those activity centers might start to grow, so it's not an either-or situation.
So, Elizabeth, from a design perspective about how we're now starting to look at how do we redesign what the office environment is to maybe provide some additional thoughts about what work looks like when you come to the office. What are the tasks that you do in the office? Because, it's from the office to the building to the downtown is really that kind of progression about how cities work.
Yeah, that's another one that's changing tremendously, and really looking at having a variety of different spaces, again, within the office, so it's not just you're at a desk or you're in a meeting room, in a big conference room, a whole variety of spaces, including rooms that allow you to do the Zoom calls, rooms that are small huddle rooms, rooms that feel more residential. People got used to working in spaces that felt a little bit more comfortable, and that did enable a different kind of thought process, so bringing some of that in. Another thing that we're really seeing is that it's not just what's in the office, it's not putting all the amenities in the office, it's really engaging with the neighborhoods around the offices. That is what people want. More than having all of their amenities in the office, they want to have a great coffee bar right outside. They want to have restaurants that they can go to. They want, access to childcare nearby in that 20-minute city, that 20-minute neighborhood. So it's really taking not only what's inside the workplace, that variety of spaces, and putting them into neighborhoods that people feel compelled to come to for their experience.
And we were talking about this a little bit a while ago too. I mean, it also, as we're seeing downtowns respond, a lot are responding with pretty strong effect through public space activation. Especially in moments where restaurants and bars have been struggling. How do you provide the kind of activities outdoors, whether through lighting installations? San Francisco has a glow-up installation over the winter. Philadelphia has substantially increased their sort of end-of-day fun stuff in civic parks.
End-of-day fun stuff.
End-of-day fun stuff. To keep folks who have been there in the office there a little bit longer and entice people to come in because there's going to be cool stuff to do downtown. And, as we look at recovery in cities across the country, one of the interesting things is that, and this actually did come from Philadelphia too, or their Center City Corporation, it's those cities that have had the highest share of downtown workers in hospitality that have come closest to coming back to where they were. Now, part of that is because those workers needed to come downtown on a regular basis anyways. I mean, remote work was not really an option there. But part of it was also that those cities tended to have a lot of activities, entertainment, tourism, activities that make coming downtown to work something that's exciting. I mean, if you're going to be coming in to work in Nashville, you might be making that choice because there's a lot of stuff that you can do with your friends afterward. Whereas places that have really been monocultures of office solely, maybe a little bit less exciting than sticking around at home and hanging out with your family.
I think that's starting to talk about the kind of new downtown. Many downtowns were that monoculture of just office, and we're standing in one right now as an example of Los Angeles and the CBD really being an office-centric thing that people would come in and leave. But if you look now at the construction that's going on and the work that's being done here, it's to bring more people to live here. And as more people begin to live downtown and can walk to work and take advantage of some of those things, I think that's starting to change it. But it's difficult in today's economic climate to build new high-rise residential or new residential at all. So one of the things that we've been looking at and we're testing here and trying to understand better is the whole notion of adaptive reuse. And City of LA has an adaptive reuse ordinance that we're working hard to try to do. And I know that HRNA and Gensler together have been kind of working and creating an assessment tool that starts to look both from a physical design and from an economic impact about what buildings what do you have to do, what from a design perspective, what buildings actually make sense for adaptive reuse, economic sense, design sense, and is that something that's going to really start to impact cities across? And I think that the 10 across cities are probably really good examples of those kind of CBDs. And so talk a little bit about kind of the assessment tool and what do we do with it to have an impact on our CBDs?
So, I think absolutely adaptive reuse has always been something that's a part of cities. But again, right now it's heightened and people are taking a much more proactive look at what can we do to really reuse this building stock. So we've started looking at a very quick assessment tool that can look at existing office buildings on a 10-point scale, talking about their bay depth and their location and their infrastructure, and doing really fairly quick sort of test fits to look at what the units could look like. Because, an office building, not to get all architecturally wonky about it, but an office building, the bay depth is much deeper than what you would ever do for a residential. So unless you want these really skinny long types of units, there can be limitations. There's very different infrastructure that needs to go into the buildings. And so you can sort of assess really quickly whether a building is even feasible to make it a residential building, and if not a residential building, what might it be transformed into? So again, we're looking at, the infrastructure side, the architectural side, the location side. Is it walkable? Are there things in the neighborhood that would be attractive to people? And we've started working with cities, and I know Kate can look at the economic side of it, but what we've also started doing is working with cities to proactively look at their, the building stock, the office building stock, particularly the office building stock that is vulnerable, that is not being occupied, that is not necessarily the Class A buildings that are still pretty attractive to tenants. And we've done it with Denver, we've done it with Calgary. I think we're working with the city of LA to get something going. And again, really proactively looking in so that they can understand which buildings might be worth pushing forward and investing in, and then I think taking a look at the economics of the whole thing.
Exactly. I mean, as we like to say with our economist hat on, technically any building could be converted if money were absolutely no object, but nobody's going to do it unless it makes financial sense. And so we've actually done a lot of collaboration with Gensler on this, and we're working right now in, we wrapped up work in Boston, an incentives program. We've collaborated with you in San Francisco. We're working in Tulsa. We're working in Atlanta. We did some work in New York. Once you've sort of understood the efficiency factor that you get from different building topologies, as well as the cost of that adaptation, we can then test, well, what is the relative value for an illustrative building topology for a property owner to keep it going as office, given the economics of office operations, vacancy, rental rates, et cetera, presuming that they're going to reposition somewhat in order to maximize the value that they can achieve. What is the relative value of that as compared with moving forward with a conversion? And under what circumstances does conversion actually make sense, both in terms of the kind of buildings that work best for that, given the efficiencies that you get and the conversion costs, the locations within a specific market, given that submarkets within downtowns are all performing differently. And then that enables communities to identify, really which portions of the stock do they want to target and what tools can they use to help move those conversions forward. I mean, there's a long history, pre-pandemic, Lower Manhattan had incentives going for a good amount of time that I think produced 22,000 units of adapted housing in Lower Manhattan. Los Angeles's adaptive reuse ordinance produced thousands of units downtown as well. HRNA actually worked on advising the modification of that recently to expand buildings that are eligible so that it's not just within the historic downtown, it's more broad than that. But in general, we see folks looking at, is it going to be an abatement that makes this feasible? That's the kind of policy that was deployed in New York, that Boston just rolled out, that DC is using. Is it going to be some kind of grant like Calgary made available, or that Chicago is deploying using their TIF financing? And in many cases, it's also, well, how do you then pair that with the regulatory streamlining that can make conversion easier? Just remove friction, which reduces risk and reduces cost. Also, frankly, gains confidence among property owners that cities and those in power are supportive of this and really going to make that happen.
Yeah, and I think the adaptive reuse, all of that is, what's actually going to make it feasible to do. And I think the adaptive reuse, a lot of people are thinking in their mind, it's the big high rises turning into, big residential high rises. But there's a real variety of things that could be, looked at: education, healthcare, and lower density buildings, 3-4 story buildings that could be changed into education facilities too, which we've been looking at as well.
And I think that mix of uses is really important, because housing is probably, in many of these markets, again, we don't know what the long-term vacancy rate is going to be. Housing is not going to fill up all of that. Even if it did, just getting those people there is probably not going to create the kind of mixed-use environment that you want. You want to mix housing with academic uses, with cultural uses, with other kinds of employment uses that haven't been there before. I think one other really important feature of the housing conversation, too, has been what is the mix of housing from an affordability standpoint that you're trying to make sure is feasible here. Conversions are challenging, and many of the markets we're working on, new construction isn't penciling right now on its own just because construction costs are so high, much less getting into a particularly challenging conversion. But this is an opportunity to not only get rid of overhanging vacancy, maybe stabilize the office market, provide for needed housing, get activation on the street, but provide for affordability as well. And that usually requires deeper subsidies in order to make that work. I think you talk to, certainly if you talk to folks in New York who worked on the Lower Manhattan incentives, they would say, find that extra subsidy to make that happen so that in the long term, you are really creating a downtown that has the mix of uses and the diverse population that creates the kind of communities that are going to be sustainable over the long term.
That mix of uses, mix of affordability is, I think, critical to what people are looking for in the experience.
Right. So in order to achieve that, it really has to be a public-private partnership, which means we really have to have policy thoughts that support that, that the private sector development community can understand, as well as kind of the incentives that come along with that. Because I know the capital stack and just putting the financing together to do those projects is really daunting. And so how that leadership role at the public sector plays a role in that is really important. Things like the adaptive reuse ordinance, and I think leadership at the federal government, the state government, the city and regional governments all working together, which was, I think, one of the themes that came out of the conversations we've had, is those kind of ideas of collaboration. And maybe this is that kind of a time when all those things can start to happen.
It absolutely has to happen that way. I think there are so many different entities that are so invested in creating our cities as thriving places. And can bring different pieces to the mix. And so it was really exciting to hear. I think what Mayor Bass is doing in terms of being so laser focused on the homeless issue is really showing some leadership and breaking down some of the barriers. There are so many more, and that all of us together are what are going to make the cities more thriving places.
I think that's exactly right. And also, I mean, there's only so much that can be done. Even if you had a perfect public-private partnership at a local level, there's only so much that you can do without the engagement of the state and without the engagement of the federal government, both from a regulatory standpoint, from an incentive standpoint. I mean, your ability to do abatements or to provide TIF, in many locations, including here, are constrained by state policy and requires that degree of collaboration. And ultimately, the funding that's necessary to ensure that affordability is part of this, that's got to come from a source that is not just local. I mean, we obviously need to be and continue to be as creative as we can about identifying creative funding strategies, but there needs to be sources that come from outside the localities too.
So the kind of elephant in the room that we really haven't talked about, we talked about it at the earlier panel, but the issue of housing and homelessness and the impacts of downtown. And I think we're all at the point now that we recognize that homelessness is a housing issue. In cities across, certainly across the 10 across, but in cities all over. And that the unhoused crisis is really exacerbated the comeback of downtowns. And you know, we're kind of a poster child for that here in LA. But are you seeing specific strategies that are starting to address this and help it, either from policy, economics, financing, that begin to start to say, how do we begin to address that to make it? I think it's a place where we're not seeing people living on the street, but also makes it safer for everybody else that's coming downtown. And I know examples of things like, you know, Mayor Bass's executive directives is starting to do that, and other things they're doing. But are you seeing some other things that are really starting to help? Are there design strategies and other kinds of strategies that start to integrate that into the thinking about downtown as a place for all?
Yeah. I think less from my day job as, you know, sort of more on the design strategy side of things, but one of the things that I think is really important that's going on is, in addition to the focus on getting people off of the streets, in addition to removing the barriers to building affordable housing, and I think it actually needs to be mixed affordable housing, is a focus also on eviction prevention, and particularly with some of the, you know, rules about eviction laws changing in November. You know, the post-COVID eviction protections sort of came off in November, but I know Mayor Bass and the We Are LA program has been very focused on it. We were talking about there's been a big focus in Houston around eviction prevention, and turning off that faucet is a key part of what we can be doing to prevent homelessness. You know, particularly for that invisible homelessness that I think was mentioned in the previous panel, the people that may be living in someone's garage, the people that may be living on someone's couch and then moving to another couch for a little while, the people that may be living in hotels, you know, families. What can be done at that stage to keep them from being kicked out of their housing is incredibly important. And that kind of support is a critical, not a design situation, but something that we can all be really focused on.
I don't have a lot to add, in part because I can't say that I've seen fabulous models for it. I mean, there's so much exciting news that's coming out of Houston that I think that the recent, you know, the panel earlier was talking about it much more length than I will. I know Atlanta's been trying to model its programs after that, and that's really exciting to see that, you know, those successes in identifying systemic strategies for that continuum of care that aren't just stopgap. I think where the tension is what do downtowns that are, you know, are what the resources and tools that they have, the entities that they have that are focused on public space management, are focused on how do we make this a welcoming and appealing place for everybody, and, you know, by necessity then have something of a short-term view on the overall response to homelessness. What is the right intersection between those actions and these much longer-term systemic strategies? And I think we're still working to figure that out. You know, what I would love to see, and I think, you know, this question of governance of our downtowns, I think is part of our larger recovery, or needs to be part of the larger recovery conversation too. You know, those that I think we've seen be most successful and, you know, through prior cycles have had downtown partnerships, bids, what have you, with substantial capacity to target resources, to provide political momentum, to you know, really focus attention, and perhaps connecting them into those broader systems of care. I'm not entirely sure what that looks like. I know, you know, Center for CAP in Atlanta, they worked on actually having caseworkers at some of their public open spaces so that they were connecting people to services in the longer term. And so it's, you know, I think it's a really critical conversation that I want to see more productive recommendations for, about how do we link those short-term solutions with those much bigger systemic strategies that are needed.
So maybe shifting gears a little bit and talk about kind of some panels about transportation infrastructure And the notion about how we move about our cities and regions has a really big impact on the quality of life and vitality. And what's interesting, for us that live in LA, I mean, there's downtown, but when we're 88 cities in our region, and we're neighborhoods all around. Even downtown is 18 different neighborhoods, from Chinatown and Little Tokyo and the Arts District. And how do we think about the idea of our transportation infrastructure, both connecting and providing opportunities for maybe higher density housing or services and things to utilize? We're making a big investment in our transportation infrastructure. How do we see that playing out both in LA and in different cities that you've had a chance to experience?
Well, I think that it's so tied into what we're talking about with housing affordability, what we're talking about with sustainability, what we're talking about in terms of building a sense of community, but particularly with the housing affordability is really trying to figure out what that transportation networks are. I don't have an answer. I see a lot of grappling with it. I see a lot of struggling to figure out whether it's in Las Vegas that, is a growing, really rapidly growing city that, with all their events, they're a very, tourism-oriented city with all their events. They're grappling with not only how do we create a network that can serve our residents and our employees, getting them to a downtown that is very hospitality-driven, and the tourists. As a part of that, I think Phoenix, is also grappling with very similar issues, and then LA on a different scale. So I don't know that I've seen really fabulous solutions to it. From my perspective, I see a lot of struggling around to serve those different populations, because it's not as nodal as it used to be, and it's not just getting employees and residents moving back and forth. I think the tourism issue is another, really interesting issue that most of the cities in this 10 corridor are going to have to struggle with too.
I'm going to sort of channel Tracy Haddon Lowe from Brookings, who is supposed to be here.
Because I could not.
And I'm not going to do a very good job of it. I encourage you to go read her work on this, which has been phenomenal. But one of the interesting patterns in transit recovery that we've seen is that obviously those peak trips between residential neighborhoods and downtowns, where you had hub and spoke systems in particular, we've seen massive drop off in those peak trips. That's not necessarily a bad thing for transit. Once you get over the fare box recovery challenges. I mean, it means that you can reduce the total number of vehicles that you're providing. A huge share of those are dedicated to those peak moments. You no longer have the inefficiencies of vehicles moving, in the reverse direction during those peak moments that are largely empty. There's other sort of cost savings around that. But what you have seen strong recovery on are bus, and in particular on movement not from the downtown to outer neighborhoods, but within neighborhoods and between neighborhoods. As you had more and more people making trips not to and from work, or running their errands from work, but running their errands from home. And as you were describing, moving or spending more of their time going to more activity nodes, not to just their jobs. And so I think our challenge becomes, how do we, recognizing that downtowns are still going to continue to add value going forward and are critical to the economy and are critical to innovation, as well as the range of social and cultural values that they've offered for a long time. How do we continue to sustain that, and recognizing also that transit provides a major resource from an equity standpoint and a climate standpoint? What are the opportunities to start to, and maybe this is where you were going a little bit, to start to rethink some of that infrastructure so it's more about connections across the perimeter and embracing those new travel patterns that we haven't seen historically? Now, that may be more likely connections made by bus or micromobility. It's not about fixed rail, but that is where there is increasing demand at this stage. And so, how do we use the variety of different creative, transit funding resources we have to support those kinds of investments? Again, I'll come back to This isn't all going to be covered by fare box recovery, and I think that there is, those are the transit systems that we see struggling the most, or those who've been that most dependent on that. There is, again, a larger state and federal role to keep these going. But transit will continue to be a major part of the way people move, and it's really realigning how we think about that hub and spoke model in particular.
And I think creating, from a design perspective, also creating the experiences on those transit systems, whether it is the hub and spoke model, whether it is the micro-mobility model, that are compelling. I know that right now a lot of people are not feeling safe on transit systems. We're hearing that a lot, and so ridership is coming down. Certainly, certain groups of people are not leaning into transit systems. So how can that be something that is compelling to a larger group of people, whether it is people, the employees, the residents, or the tourists, which I think, again, in all of our cities are a big economic engine.